the uniqueness of Amphan to the recurrence and to the question of, that we need, which that we are almost kind of, informed by a well-established scholarship in South Asia that cyclones are not merely naturally caused. The cyclones disasters are have a particular social and political context to them. There's a sense in which cyclones have their trajectory in the social and political, uh, you know, uh, contingent context. Let's put it this way. And this is more significant in the case of a vulnerable landscape like that of the Sundarbans. Uh, what happens when the disaster strikes? The biggest threat that disaster poses, whether it's Amphan or Aila or Hudhud or Pailin, that it destroys, devastates the single most important lifeline that exists in the Sundarbans, the lifeline of people, which we call the dikes or the embankments or the bands, which are the mud walls erected around the settled islands in order to protect them from daily inundation at least twice during high tide. As Sundarban Islanders, during high tide, he lives on an island where he goes to bed at least 10 to 12 feet beneath water level. Of course, thinking and assuming that the embankments will be in place and the water will not spill over, but this is exactly the lifeline which goes a moment a cyclone strikes. This very lifeline, which was a kind of a barrier, which sort of which marks the settled islands off from the forested delta. And Sundarbans, when we refer to Sundarbans, we include all of these in plurality. That is why it's called Sundarbans, which includes the forested islands, settled islands, and other important, significant, features that characterize this delta that we call Sundarbans. Now, when we say that it is recurrent, it is that there is a context, political and economic context for disasters, and you understand them better when you look at a vulnerable landscape, is when I actually look at the historical trajectory of the Sundarbans. Why did these settled islands need such embankments? If we look at this, can I have the slide number 19, please? Slide number 19. Now, this is a typical picture of an embankment, which is a mud wall, which is also a very important pathway that connects different portions, different places on an island, as well as this is something that connects one island to another. Of course, when you reach one end of an island, you just go down, get on a boat and just moves across the river to another island. But my question, which is central, that why did we at all have these embankments in place? Can we have slide number 18, please? Now, this is where we zero in on a region which was, not only vulnerable in the sense that moment we call Sundarbans, we attach a sense of layer of vulnerability to it, almost taking its naturality for granted. It is here that we try and, denaturalize the so-called natural. In other words, what I'm trying to suggest is that a region was produced, created, constituted into a vulnerable landscape by a particular process. Can I have slide number 18, please? Can you hear? Thank you. That it was, the early century of the British colonial rule in India. If you look at the first 100 years of the colonial rule of the East India Company, you would find that obviously benefiting largely from the Industrial Revolution of England, land was considered as a very significant asset, number one, and forest was considered as limiting, that the more you have forest, the less land you have for cultivation, which was one of the major sources of the revenue, obviously something needless to say, for the company's cover in the early years. And therefore, for the first 100 years, there was absolutely clearing of forest that took place in colonial Sundarbans, where the laborers were indentured from different parts of India. And that is why you have a very significant tribal or Adivasi settlement in different parts of the Sundarban who were indentured as the laborers to sort of engage in this process of reclamation of land, primarily from the water and the forest. Of course, we know that the permanent settlement for the rest of Bengal, but unfortunately, Sundarban was not included in the permanent settlement. It was kept out of permanent settlement because of its peculiar watery, fluid landscape, where demarcating land from water was always a problem. And therefore, to prevent zamindars from making inroads into these lands, wetlands, government had to devise a number of policies, implement number of acts in order to, make the clearing of forest and settlement of people possible. So it was for the whole of early sort of 19th century and the second half, what we saw, the undivided, unpartitioned Sundarbans of erstwhile, what we call today Bangladesh and India, particularly Bakharganj, Khulna, Jessore, these parts were reclaimed first, and the places closer to the forest, to the Bay of Bengal, were only towards the later part of almost the end of 19th century, after the passing of the Forest Act, well into the 20th century, the initial part, they were ultimately kind of spared and the forest was retained. But the first 100 years, 150 years, it is the clearing of this forest which allowed for settlement to take place, where the wealthy people, sometimes direct settlement with the tillers who were available to till the soil, they were given, they were considered as grantees, given lands to cultivate, and it entirely fell upon them to sort of reclaim the land and make it possible for rice cultivation, etc., which served two purposes. One was revenue, and also to make this frontier, which was almost lying absolutely unguarded, for the pirates to attack and create a major problem for the colonial government, that to make this place populated, look as though they are populated, so that could effectively kind of serve as a natural frontier. Now, obviously, such settlement allowed for the embankment to be built, because the natural process of siltation could not raise the land sufficiently above the water level during its high tide. And hence, to protect these islands, which were already getting settled, there had to be a mud wall built all around it to protect them. That's how the story of the embankment came in and became constitutive part of Sundarban's topography. These embankments, even this speaks largely true for the entire Gangetic Delta, that the embankments of these baths as a flood control strategy proved disastrous over a period of time, as it not only clogged channels of the rivers, it caused river to run in a manner in which it often ate into the existing land, although the particular river current, particular way in which river flowed in a particular direction could also allow for the possibility of a land emerging at the other end, which we often call the new land. So it was the peculiarity of the watery fluidity of the delta produced under colonial rule in a particular way with its all hydrology, which accounted for its serious vulnerable nature. Something which is what we are kind of condemned to see, sort of destined to see in the post-independent India. These earthen embankments, slide number 20, please. These baths and embankments, which are supposed to protect people from their daily inundation, spell disaster for them. Baths are eroded both by river currents, which are kind of imperceptible, something that happens on an everyday basis, whereby the river flows in a particular manner, eating into the very, very base of the embankment in such a way that the embankment becomes hollow at the bottom and the top simply caves in during high tide. And the other is the embankments are breached, they are damaged, they collapse, and they inundate during a cyclone or a super cyclone. These baths and embankments, which are supposed to protect people from their daily inundation, the first lifeline goes, the embankment collapses. It leaves villages and tracts of agricultural land inundated for a considerable long period of time. A couple of quick slides might give you an idea as to what happens. This is a jetty which is completely sort of disappearing into the water, almost on the verge of disappearing. The embankment, slide number 22, please. Now, this is an embankment path, but which absolutely breached, not only breached, but if you have a very close look, you understand that the height of the embankment is such that there is very little protection left for the villagers or their lands, which you could see the other side. The gentleman with his cycle, to his left, you have the agricultural lands. 23 slide, please. This is once again caving in. This is a pathway, this is an embankment, but it's particularly caving in because, as I said, that the bottom has suddenly become very, very hollow, absolutely vacuous, therefore not being able to hold the top any longer. And it's almost leaning onto the river and is going to go very soon. Slide 24, please. You could see that absolutely broken top of the embankment, which is almost non-negotiable. You cannot even walk, and during monsoon, you cannot even stand erect, let alone walk along this terrain. 25, please. Slide. This is a typical case of a complete, flooding, inundation of an island. You could see that the embankment completely goes. You have the people already, lined up on the embankment, and the village is completely sort of inundated with brackish, salt saline water. The whole of Gangetic Delta, where we have evidence and records of how land often been lost to the water. The classic case of Malda and Murshidabad. That erosion and disappearance of land, but it is all about the water which is fresh. It's a fresh flooding. Fresh water which floods, inundates, and once the water recedes, retreats, it allows for the field to become cultivable. But this is exactly contrary to what happens and unfolds in the Sundarbans. It is the saline water inundation. Because, as I said, it is the water hurtling down the Himalayas, which kind of, gets to meet the river currents from Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean. And it's the brackishness of the water which makes houses go under the water in no time. Their roofs collapse, fly away. Their agricultural fields completely get salinated. That not only that not only destroys the current prospect of a harvest or an agriculture, but it leaves the agricultural fields unsuitable for cultivation in years to come. We had a complete saline inundation after Ayla, and the same had happened after Amphan. So the people who were coming back with lands, with no lands whatsoever, they kind of, they kind of, it was as if the brackish water was the greatest leveler. It ironed out the differences between those who were inside, the one who never migrated out, and the ones who were coming back, as the process of reverse migration was on because of the COVID-19. And their ponds, the only source of a fresh water, if you want to wash your face, you go to the pond. That gets salinated, that gets contaminated, and the fish die. All livestock are absolutely, they go haywire, killed. And that's exactly the scenario which Amphan has left them in. Just to quickly give you a sense of what has Amphan done this time. Can I have slide number 29, please? The whole village is inundated. A child and mother. 30 slide, please. This is a surge. You can make, you can now probably will be able to make out that with such surge, what you have for embankment doesn't, stand anymore as being a very significantly protective wall that separates land from water and, people from disaster. 31 slide, please. Life on the threshold almost, having lost everything. Now, it is the peculiar constitution of this land and landscape with their embankments that spell disaster for people. Not only during a cyclone like Amphan, or even without, as I said, the imperceptible process of daily erosion that takes place when a river goes across, the flows across along a particular island, eating into its land, then you have no other alternative but to constantly be on the back foot. You almost fight with your back to the wall. A slide, will give you a kind of an idea, although this is a kind of a survey, kind of a map, which was procured long back. It is slide number 27, please. If I could have slide number 27. This is a picture of what exactly I mean by the everyday erosion. This is the land space on an island which remain between rivers on both sides, as the rivers are eating into the land on both sides. Two different rivers, but they seem to be sort of, flowing into the island instead of away from the island. And this is exactly what makes, there are about 150, 200 families crammed, huddled in this stretch, with houses almost kind of, almost kind of rubbing their shoulders against each other, who have no is a place which kind of suffered recovering from its impact and effect with very little land, shrunk even further, and it is almost that this land is going to go eventually in time to come. And this is exactly what I said, that the peculiar constitution of a topography, the political, economic, engineering will, as it produced vulnerability, that not only was done historically, but historical blunder that was to be, felt at every now and then whenever a cyclone strikes this deltaic Sundarbans. Uh, you know, number of you know number of reasons that we could cite, but to just kind of give you a sense of what I exactly meant by the social and political context of the disaster is that when the Ayla happened in 2009, after the Amphan, the aid and the money was declared by the government. This was declared even after Ayla. But one cyclone follows the other. Sundarban is in the news. Aid is announced, and relief and aid was supposed to have reached the vulnerable, the ones who have suffered the most. And yet, somewhere I have read long back a book called Aid as Imperialism. What I want to sort of say here today, that aid as power, aid as producing hierarchies, aid as producing vulnerability, instead of aid being seen as relief, as care for the vulnerable, aid has continued to be seen as the fight for power and injustice. And it is here that one has to locate the impact of a cyclone in the time of a pandemic. That what is it that it does to the people who are already jobless, absolutely starving people, lost their lands, houses, ponds, and still many of them continue to live their lives under plastic sheets on broken embankments in the cyclone shelters, houses still not repaired, ponds not desalinated, and they do not have the opportunity, like what happened during the Ayla, that they could go out of Sundarbans. Going out seems to be almost out of question. Now, this is what I consider as the social political context of a vulnerable landscape, which are not only sculpted, as I said in the beginning of my deliberation, that which are not only sculpted by the rivers and the tributaries and the particular way in which the land and water make their union and separation possible,
কি প্রবলেম হচ্ছে প্রবীর?
Can you hear me now?
Yes sir.
Yes, sir. We can
Is
hear
it
you.
audible?
Yes,
Yes,
yes
sir.
sir.
Can you?
Yes.
Okay, okay, okay,
Okay, please continue.
okay. Yeah. Um, so basically, the point with which I was talking about the social and the political context of disaster, and the point that I was trying to suggest that the question of the planned retreat for people, that since people had claimed this land some 200 years back, people today might as well be prepared to, let this their land and everything go, because is it still there?
Yeah, it's okay, fine, sir.
Is what they needed to come to terms with this realization that they need to leave this place. And the question with which I would end, because it's been interruptive, time and again, is it still there? It's happening. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sir.
Okay.
শোনা যাচ্ছে।
Okay. So the point with which I would finish is that now the question of the planned retreat looks as absolutely absurd as anything that one could be, one could think of or envisage for these people who have been, in who have been constantly under the threat of disasters of different kinds, and therefore it is the social and the political context of the life that is lived on the delta that needs to be looked at afresh, in the sense that the questions which become important and significant with every disaster is what exactly being done for these people. What has happened to the embankments for years between two disasters? What has happened to different power structures who are capable of bringing in difference to the life that people live in this delta? In the sense, we have an irrigation department which is largely a flood control measure, which is an erstwhile imperialist kind of an instrument, which had not altered its character as we moved into independent India. That it is not simply flood control, but Sundarbans is also a place where the rivers flow, and therefore it is important that one need to know the exact record of the rivers flowing at different intersections, at different islands, and therefore irrigation department in collaboration with the rivers, because there is a river research institute in Bengal as well as India, but hardly has a collaboration there between the irrigation department and the river research institutes. There has been very little attempt to understand, study the behavior of the river as it moves along. Therefore, a comprehensive understanding of the region is what is found terribly lacking when I say that there is a lack of engineering will, developmental apathy that leaves people every time a disaster strikes. And it is unique that these lives which are struck by the disaster, after every cyclone, they build their lives. Not, they do everything possible to begin to salvage their land, property, house, in a manner in which, as if everything was almost razed to the ground. And this is possible by the people who are vulnerable yet resilient. It is the time-tested disasters and the social and political context of disaster that has made these people appear resilient, exactly the way they had done after the earlier disasters. And it is with that I would conclude by saying that my last slide, which is the slide number 32. If it is possible to bring the slide, please. It's not happening, right? Nivedita?
স্যার একটু wait করুন, ও কার্সারটা নিয়ে যাচ্ছে।
Just the last slide. We need to come to end. Yeah, just the last slide, please. Yeah, this is like a it is almost like a metaphorical. The resilient life strikes back after every cyclone, after every disaster that has struck the region. And yet, we would forget Sundarbans, forget people until the next disaster strikes. And we hope only against hope that we would hear about Sundarban when there is no disaster has ever happened. Thank you so much. Thank you for